Mr. Speaker, in the summer of 1940, the police arrived at a wedding on Dante Street in Montreal. They were there for one of the guests, Giuseppe Visocchi. The officers who took him away told his family that they just had to speak with him, but he would be able to come right back. He didn't. Within weeks, he was at a prisoner of war camp in Petawawa, wearing a uniform marking him as an internee, with a target on the back and the number 770. It would be another 2 years until Giuseppe came home. 2 années.
2 years while his 7 children needed their father. 2 years while his wife didn't know how she was going to feed them or keep a roof over their heads. 2 years while this single mother had to survive without money and without being able to ask for help from family members because they were afraid of reprisals.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the story of just one man or just one family. During the Second World War, 31,000 Italian Canadians were labeled enemy aliens and then fingerprinted, scrutinized, and forced to report to local registrars once a month. Just over 600 men were arrested and sent to internment camps, and 4 women were detained and sent to jail. They were business owners, workers, and doctors. They were fathers, daughters, and friends. When the authorities came to their door, when they were detained, there were no formal charges, no ability to defend themselves in an open and fair trial, no chance to present or rebut evidence. Yet still, they were taken away to Petawawa or to Fredericton, to Kananaskis or to Kingston. Once they arrived at the camp, there was no length of sentence. Sometimes the internment lasted a few months, sometimes it lasted years. But the impacts, those lasted a lifetime. Des réputations.
Reputations were ruined. Businesses were shut down. Families were left with no livelihood. Children were rejected by their friends or pulled out of school. These stories, out of shame and fear, have gone untold for too long. For too many generations, this injustice has been a heavy burden.
When, on June 10, 1940, this House of Commons declared war on Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, Canada did not also have to declare war on Italian Canadians. To stand up to the Italian regime that had sided with Nazi Germany, that was right. But to scapegoat law-abiding Italian citizens, that was wrong. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, as Canadians were being asked to come together to support the war effort, as people were being reminded to do their part, some were being treated as enemies, even though they had committed no crime. The internment policy was unjust. It went against the values that we had gone to war to defend. It went against the values that Italian Canadians had enlisted to protect, despite the fact that members of their family had been interned in camps. And it went against the values that were the strength of our country, like fairness, due process, equality under the law, values that would later be enshrined in our charter. The way that Italian Canadians were treated by the government was unacceptable, and that treatment caused real harm. And not only to the men and women who were interned and to their families, but also to the generations who have lived with that legacy of discrimination. It is time to make amends.
Mr. Speaker, Signor Presidente, I rise in this House today to issue an official apology on behalf of Italian Canadians, on behalf of the Government of Canada, for the internment of Italian Canadians during the Second World War. To the men and women who were taken to prisoner of war camps or jail without charge, people who are no longer with us to hear this apology. To the tens of thousands of innocent Italian Canadians who were labeled enemy aliens. To the children and grandchildren who have carried a past generation's shame and hurt. And to their community, a community that has given so much to our country, we are sorry. Chiediamo scusa. A tous ceux qui ont été touchés.
To all those who were affected by this chapter in our history, we are sorry. Your families and your communities did not deserve this injustice. And despite everything, despite that dark time, you continue to look ahead.
Heard your stories. We have heard your stories. How once your parent or grandparent was released, they worked hard to give back to their country, despite how its government had treated them. Every thriving business these men and women rebuilt, or local charity they started, was a testament to their commitment to Canada. Everyone who became a service member in the Canadian Armed Forces or a representative in government was an example of their dedication to their fellow citizens. What better way to show that the injustice done to them had been a mistake? What better way to prove that they loved the country they had chosen to call home? It would have been so easy to turn their backs on Canada. Instead, they put their backs into building it. That is their legacy, and it is a legacy that lives on today. To everyone who has had the courage to speak up about this painful chapter in our history, to people like Anita, who told me about how her father never stopped loving this country, or Zita and her daughter, who spoke about their family's resilience. You honor your father or grandfather and the kind of person he taught you to be.
To the members of my own caucus who have worked tirelessly to bring justice to the Italian Canadian community, and to the organizations across the country who have worked to make this moment a reality, you are putting us on a better path. And to all the Italian Canadians who enrich our communities from St. John's to Vancouver, from Montreal to the far north, you remind us that diversity will always be our strength. Courage, resilience, and an unshakable conviction that we are stronger together. Those are just a few of the values that Italian Canadians have always embodied.
Mr. Speaker, when almost 80 years ago, Giuseppe came back to his family from the POW camp, he worked hard to build a better life. He bought a house, saw his kids grow up, and taught them to be good, upstanding citizens who loved their country. Courage, resilience, and an unshakable belief that we are stronger together. That was the path he chose, and that is the path we must continue to choose today. La via giusta è stata dimostrata dagli internati e le loro famiglie: integrità, unità, fede e fidelità al Canada. Per questo tutto il Paese è riconoscente. Grazie di cuore. Internees and their families showed the way. Integrity, solidarity, faith, and loyalty to Canada. For this, our country is ever grateful. Thank you. Merci. Grazie.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in 1940, Anthony Danesi was 23 years old when the RCMP, under orders from the government in Ottawa, arrested him and his brother at their home in Toronto. They took them away without charge, and they were interned in a camp in Petawawa. These are his words that describe the terror his family felt some 80 years ago. Quote, "My mother at the time was over 60 years old, and when she heard they were taking us away, she fainted on the floor from the shock. We were told, do not touch her, leave her there. We had to leave our home with the RCMP and a vision of my mother in a heap on the floor. Even a dog would have been treated better. On Christmas Day, my father passed away, but we were not allowed to come home to pay our respects or go to his funeral. I spent, along with my brother, 2 years and 12 days interned, seeing my mother and sister only once. God only knows how they managed. We were released and sent home to try and pick up our lives and to try and clear the debts which had accumulated." End quote. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of Italian-Canadian families during World War II were forced to try and pick up their lives and recover from a trauma that had been inflicted upon them by their government. Le 10 juin.
On June 10, 1940, the Government of Canada, then headed by Prime Minister Mackenzie King, declared that tens of thousands of Italian Canadians were enemy aliens. The federal government then ordered the internment of some of those Canadians in camps. These individuals were arrested without due process and without the fundamental rights given them under the Canadian legislation. Thousands were subject to investigation and their fingerprints were taken. A number of them were victims of intimidation and harassment.
They were viewed with suspicion by their government and treated like second-class citizens, often only because of their surname or pride in their heritage. The impacts of this gross mistreatment would last for decades and pass through generations. As Leader of the Official Opposition on this solemn day, I want to use my time to talk about just a few of the families Canadians need to remember today. Take, for example, the Gustini family from Ontario. Giuseppe Gustini and his daughter Linda witnessed her father being taken away in handcuffs from the grocery store he owned and operated in Timmins, Ontario. Giuseppe Gustini lost his liberty and dignity because he was known for helping new immigrants from Italy arriving in Timmins with a job at his store or helping them find a job in the mines of Northern Ontario. He would get them settled and send some of their hard-earned savings back to their family in Italy. Today, Mr. Speaker, we celebrate and present awards to charitable Canadians like Giuseppe. Today, we would consider him a pillar of the community for helping people succeed in their new country. But in 1940, our country stripped the Gustini family of a husband and a father. The trauma was something his daughter Linda remembered for the rest of her life. She passed along this difficult family story to her children. And I know that her son Joe, Giuseppe's grandson, is watching from his home in Barrie, Ontario today. I hope your family finds some comfort in this recognition today of the suffering caused to your family. William Casanova was just 9 years old when he witnessed the arrest of his father, Erminio Casanova, at their home in Windsor, Ontario. After almost 2 years of internment, Erminio was released but tragically died only a few months later. William wrote that his family had lost their dignity, their pride, and their financial security. His mother suffered mental trauma from his father's internment and was institutionalized for nearly 15 years. Another example of a family broken. Les conséquences d'être accusé.
The consequences of being accused of being enemy aliens by one's own country tore the soul from these countries. The consequences left deep wounds in our country's Italo-Canadian communities. Some families changed their names in order to hide their connection to this time of our history. Others moved to another province. Many even left Canada to escape internment.
I want to thank Dr. Anna Maria Castrilli for sharing with me some of the letters from internees and their families so that my remarks could lend a voice to citizens that were failed long ago. En 1990, ces lettres.
In 1990, these letters and souvenirs were collected by the National Congress of Italian Canadians. The goal was to inform Canadians about this dark chapter of our history. That same year, the Congress, as well as Italian Canadian cultural and heritage organizations, welcomed Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in Toronto. Hundreds of people, many victims who were still alive at the time, attended the event.
What Prime Minister Brian Mulroney said this day over 30 years ago now is worth repeating in this chapter today. Quote, "What happened to many Italian Canadians is deeply offensive to the simple notion of respect for human dignity and the presumption of innocence. The brutal injustice was inflicted arbitrarily, not only on individuals suspected of being security risks, but also on individuals whose only crime was being of Italian origin. It was often, in the simplest of terms, an act of prejudice, organized and carried out under the law, but prejudice nonetheless. This kind of behavior was not then, is not now, and never will be acceptable as a civilized nation that purports to respect the rule of law. On behalf of the Government of Canada and the people of Canada, I offer a full and unqualified apology for the wrongs done to our fellow Canadians of Italian origin during World War II. Monsieur le Président, j'aurais aimé.
Mr. Speaker, I would have liked for members of the Italian Canadian community be present here with us today. Unfortunately, I know that public health restrictions due to COVID-19 do not allow this.
Whether it was the apology from Prime Minister Mulroney at an event hosted by the Italian Canadian community in 1990, or the one delivered today in our House of Commons, both are equally important. They acknowledge the pain caused to thousands of Canadians by their own government. We cannot heal the trauma inflicted upon the Danesi family. We cannot help a young Linda Gustini or William Casanova forget the terror of watching their fathers being taken away from them in their family store or in their home, Mr. Speaker. Ce que nous devons faire aujourd'hui, c'est.
What we must do today is to apologize to their descendants. We must recognize the deep impact that these events had on their families. We have to show that we will never forget this sad chapter of our history, as well as the costs in human lives.
Also remember that from our earliest history, millions have come to Canada for a better life and have contributed to the building of our great country. Sir Wilfrid Laurier perhaps put it best, quote, "We do not want nor wish that any individual should forget the land of his origin. Let them look to the past, but let them still more look to the future. Let them look to the land of their ancestors, but let them look also to the land of their children. Let them become Canadians and give their heart, give their soul, their energy, and all their power to Canada. For over a century, Italian Canadians have indeed given their big hearts, their tireless energy, and their labor to Canada. Les Italo-Canadiens ont toujours
Italian Canadians have always looked to the future. They contributed to shaping our history, even in the face of discrimination and adversity. That makes their contribution to our country even more powerful.
I know from speaking about the 1990 apology with Prime Minister Mulroney and former Senator Consiglio Danino that the Italian-Canadian community wanted to celebrate their contributions in equal measure to preserving the history of the internment, discrimination, and hardship. Prime Minister Mulroney urged his audience to look at the impressive Toronto skyline after they left the event that day. Just look at it, he said. The first generation of Italian immigrants to Canada built those buildings. The second generation owns them. That, my friends and colleagues, is the Canada we are all, regardless of party, trying to build, foster, and advance today. Aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président,
Today, Mr. Speaker, we are going to write a new chapter of Canada's history. A chapter that doesn't erase the injustices of the past, but that does help us look to the future.
Mr. Speaker, and it's good to see an Italian Canadian in the chair, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my colleagues in the House and of Conservative Party members from across this great country, many Italian Canadians among them, I want to add our name and the opposition's name to the apology delivered by the Prime Minister today. Thank you, Mr. President. Merci beaucoup.
L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle.
Monsieur le Président, le Canada, dans sa courte
Mr. Speaker, Canada, in its short existence, has committed many reprehensible acts. Think of the First Nations and Inuit nations who have experienced and continue to experience discrimination, while many communities still lack access to clean water. Think of the Chinese community who were unfairly taxed when they came to Canada and who worked on the railroad in deplorable conditions. Think of Ontario's Regulation 17 to assimilate Franco-Ontarians and other similar laws passed in other provinces. Think of the members of the Japanese community who were interned during the Second World War. Another community victimized by Canada is, of course, the Italian-Canadian community. This community richly deserves an apology from the federal government. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I join my colleagues in denouncing the treatment of the Italian-Canadian community from 1940 to 1945. At that time, Canada had implemented the War Measures Act. This allowed it to intern and to discriminate against many Canadians without a warrant on the sole grounds that they were from countries with which Canada was at war. The government quickly took a series of discriminatory measures against its own citizens. This was the case for Italian Canadians after Canada declared war on Italy on June 10, 1940. Overnight, 31,000 Italian Canadians were officially designated as enemy aliens solely because they were from Italy. Some of these people had lived in Canada for decades. They were fully integrated into society, and yet they were still enemies in the eyes of Canada. This designation of enemy aliens was accompanied by a series of discriminatory measures against people who had not committed any crime. These measures included the requirement that all Italian-born persons register with the authorities with monthly checks and restrictions on their freedom of movement across Canada. The government could enter people's homes and conduct searches of their property. While Canada was desperately short of labor to help the war effort in factories, Italian Canadians lived in extreme poverty, often unable to find basic employment. Boycotts against Italian Canadian-owned businesses were common. The government also seized and ordered the closure of Italian associations. There were also the imprisonment of more than 600 Italian Canadians between 1940 and 1945. In Montreal alone, 200 men were interned. These men were imprisoned because they were thought to be sympathetic to Mussolini's fascist regime, and sometimes they were. Mussolini's regime did use the diaspora to further its own interests. Many Italian nationals, like many other Canadians, were seduced by fascism, but many of the Italian Canadians interned had no connection to Mussolini's regime. Their internment was discriminatory and unfounded. If the internment of these men was unjust, imagine the difficulties experienced by their relatives. The testimony received from their families is blood-curdling. Women, often already living in poverty, were suddenly left alone with several children, no income, no government assistance. Children died of malnutrition in the complete indifference of the authorities. Some women had to work 3 jobs to ensure that their children could eat. Families didn't have news about their detained loved ones for months. All of these stories show how the policies of the Canadian government left deep scars on an entire community. We cannot remain indifferent to the discrimination experienced by Italian Canadians. The government is apologizing to this community today after more than 80 years. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I wish to reiterate to the Italian Quebec community all of our gratitude for their important contribution to Quebec society. Denouncing their unfair treatment by the government is an essential step in recognizing their contribution to our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Monsieur le Président, je me lève aujourd'hui.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in this House to mark this historic moment. This apology will give Italian Canadian families the justice they were waiting for and that they deserve. This was indeed a dark chapter, and not the only one, in Canada's history. The internment of Italian Canadians is a dark chapter that has haunted families and stained our country's history for decades.
This long-awaited apology will give Canadian Italians the justice they've waited for and they deserve. This was indeed a dark chapter and not the only one in Canada's history. The internment of Italian Canadians is a dark chapter that has haunted families and has stained our country's history for decades. On June 10th, 1940, Italy declared war on Canada. That very evening, Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced that he had ordered the internment of hundreds of Italian Canadians identified by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as enemy aliens. An estimated 600 Italian Canadians were interned in camps by the federal government. The majority of those interned were from areas with the highest concentration of Italian Canadians at the time, Montreal, Toronto, and communities across Ontario, and some documented cases in Western Canada. Camps were situated in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Alberta. Internment was up to 3 years, and the average interned person was held for almost 16 months. People interned were doctors, lawyers, carpenters, bakers, contractors, priests, and loved ones. The RCMP arrested Italian Canadians without due process, put them on trains, and sent them to internment camps. Canada declared them enemies of the state for no other reason than being who they were, Italian Canadians. Souvent, les parents étaient séparés de leur...
Often, parents were separated from their children. Innocent people were sent to internment camps and forced to leave behind their families to fend for themselves. Women were forced to look for work to become breadwinners and take care of their big families. Italian Canadian children were pulled out of schools because they too were deemed to be enemies of the state.
Parents were separated from their children. Innocent people were sent to internments, forced to leave behind their families to fend for themselves. Women were forced to look for work to become breadwinners and take care of their families. Italian Canadian children were pulled out of schools because they too were deemed enemies of the state. This injustice tore families apart. The pain, degradation, and anxiety these families had to endure didn't have to happen. The federal government went even further. It froze bank accounts. It forced Italian Canadians to subsist on as little as $12 a month. Many Italian families were forced to sell their homes, businesses, and family heirlooms. It was a system that was purposely designed to keep people out of the rightful place in society. There was no reason outside of prejudice to suspect that those in turn posed any threat whatsoever to Canada or Canadians. Many of them were First World War veterans who had fought for their adopted country. Like the internment of Japanese Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians, German Canadians, and so many others, the forced registration and internment of Italian Canadians is a dark chapter of our history. Imagine the pain felt when learning that your loved one was sent to an internment camp for no reason. Imagine the fear and confusion a family had to go through because they didn't know where the police had taken a loved one. While an apology is long overdue, restitution can only be accomplished with compensation for Italian Canadian families that were impacted, that Canada had wronged. Canada has one of the largest Italian diasporas in the world. Despite the internment and many other challenges and barriers faced by Italian Canadians, the community went on to make significant contributions to our country and continue to do so.
I recognize that many of those who should hear today's apology, those who were put in internment camps by the Canadian government, are no longer with us. But I hope that today's apology will provide a certain level of comfort and healing to their descendants.
I recognize that many of those who should hear today's apology, those who were put in an internment camp by the Canadian government, are no longer with us. But I hope that today's apology will provide a level of comfort and healing to their descendants. And to everyone in this House, let's recommit to never letting this type of injustice ever happen again. From its foundation, Canada has committed injustices against the first people of this land, against those who fled wars to seek refuge, against those who came here simply to build a better life. Canada must act to right these wrongs of the past so we build a fairer and more just future for all. Let's make sure that all our work in this House of Commons is always invested in building that fairer and more just society for all. Thank you. Merci.
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Island is rising on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to be allowed to participate in this historic apology on behalf of the Green Party.
Will the member have unanimous consent? We have unanimous consent. Please proceed.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank all my colleagues for this honor to speak today. to discuss the very important sentiments of all my colleagues and leaders of all parties for this historic apology to the Italian-Canadian community that were interned and the entire community affected by this injustice.
It's obviously never too late to apologize. My honorable colleagues, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Official Opposition, and the Leader of the New Democratic Party, and I was particularly touched by the words of our colleague from Laurentide Labelle in her speech, focusing on how much this affected the mothers and the children left behind, the notion of a Canadian child dying from malnutrition while their father was wrongly imprisoned for years during a war that they were not participating in, and they were not a threat to Canada. This apology is a long time coming, and so many of those who were directly affected, who were interned, are not any longer with us. But their children and their grandchildren have been long waiting for this apology. The Leader of the Official Opposition, of course, made the point that it was in 1990 that former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, made a full apology, but as was related, it was seen, and it was insufficient in that it was not in the House of Commons. The apology from Prime Minister Mulroney was certainly a comprehensive, full apology, but it did not have the gravitas that the apology today will have. Another former Prime Minister attempted to make this right. In 2005, former Prime Minister Paul Martin put forward a plan for an apology with funds set aside for reparations and to mark the contributions that Italian Canadians had made. But an election intervened, and that specific apology and those specific funds were never designated to their intended recipients. The Italian community of Canada had been so wrongly abused through the course of the Second World War. And finally, we had a private member's bill from former member from Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel, Massimo Picchetti, put forward a private member's bill in 2009 to finally have an apology in this House. Well, today, thanks to our current Prime Minister, and I do thank him, this is the appropriate apology that Italian Canadian communities and individuals, particularly those who actually were interned, and their children and their grandchildren, and all of those affected by this grievous wrong. The assumption that if you were an Italian Canadian, you were a fascist. It's very clear that that was not the case. People were arrested, taken from their families, not to see them for years. I note some historians are now questioning in our daily press whether we should be careful not to apologize too fully. I reject that. I reject that because if people hold ideas, if they were persuaded at some point that maybe one or two people may have been part of fascist organizations, they were denied due process. They were thrown in jail. They were not allowed to see their families. This was a wrong. And most of the people arrested from the historical records that I can find had nothing whatsoever to do with any political movement and were loyal Canadians. So let the apology be full. Let it be made clear that people in their time, the Canadians who made this decision, the Prime Minister who made this decision, made a mistake. Just as we did when we decided to intern thousands of Japanese Canadians, just as we did on the many, many apologies we've had in this place, when we decided if you were LGBTQ Canadian, you could not have a job in the government. So many apologies in this place, but it doesn't in any way dilute the importance of the apologies. The apologies to the families of Salvatore Vistarci, of Nicola Dogadnieri, and I note his grandson rose through the ranks of the RCMP without ever knowing his grandfather had been interned. The very touching story of Guido Nincieri, one of Canada's leading artists. And if you search the records of his life through our universal source of information these days, Wikipedia, his internment isn't mentioned because his achievements as an artist were so extraordinary that it's a small footnote that his family had to fight to get him out of jail because of the wrong assumptions about what he believed politically. What we hold in our minds and what we think about, what we care about, doesn't criminalize us, not since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I note with gratitude that our speaker, as the Prime Minister said, Signore Presidente, the first Italian Canadian to hold the chair of Speaker. I note our Minister of Justice, whose name I will not use, but another proud Italian Canadian. Thank you, grazie, grazie to all in this government who have finally made this apology complete. Thank you to the leader of the official opposition, leader of the New Democratic Party, and the Bloc Québécois for making it very clear that all of us appreciate what the Italian Canadian community does for this country day to day, and that we apologize from the bottom of our hearts as best we can in 2021 for the wrongs of 1940. Merci. Thank you, Mr. President.
I'm going to have to check the standing orders what the penalty is for making the speaker cry or choking him up. So, reports from interparliamentary delegations. Présentation de rapport.
Presenting reports from committees.
Introduction of private members' bills. Mr. Mazur, seconded by Mr. Lloyd, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Telecommunications Act,